G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our webinar series. I would like to acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. The Australia Institute has an ongoing webinar series of which tonight is just one episode that we're very thankful that you've come along this evening to hear about. But you can check out our other webinars on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. And just quickly, the Australia Institute is delighted to be hosting President Jose Ramos Horta, Nobel Peace Prize winner and President of Timor-Leste, for a special event at the Sydney Opera House on Tuesday, the 8th of October. Tickets are $19.50 and you can get them from the Sydney Opera House website or the link on our website. Just a few tips before we begin today to help this run smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box where you can type in questions for our special guest this evening, and you can upvote other people's questions and comments as well. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And finally, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it will go up on our YouTube channel and on our website later tomorrow. So we are absolutely delighted this evening to be joined by renowned British journalist, author and environmental and political activist George Monbiot. George writes a regular column for The Guardian and has written several books. He's the recipient of the 2022 Orwell Prize for Journalism, and his latest book, co-authored with Peter Hutchison, is called The Invisible Doctrine, The Secret History of Neoliberalism and How It Came to Control Your Life. We're so grateful to have you starting your day early with us while we're here tonight in Australia. Thanks for joining us, George.
Thank you so much, Emily, and great to meet you all.
And also joining me this evening is the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Director, Polly Hemming. George, before we get stuck in, we've kind of operated on the assumption you're not overly familiar with the Australian context. So just for a little bit of context before we dig in tonight, I will hand over to Polly to kick off the discussion just shortly. But just a few weeks from now, the Australian government will be hosting the world's first global nature positive summit in Sydney. And things are pretty dire, according to the last State of the Environment report. Our environment is officially poor and deteriorating. Many of Australia's ecosystems are collapsing thanks to climate change, habitat loss, invasive species. And the Nature Positive Summit, though I'm not sure exactly what that means, obviously sounds like a good idea, but it's a bit nonsensical to listen to, and reading it sounds a bit like a financial prospectus. Sessions at that big Nature Positive Global Summit include greening the financial system, innovative finance for nature, blue finance, and unlocking the future of biodiversity markets, all part of a vision from our government for a green Wall Street that our Environment Minister announced back in 2022. Polly, I'll hand over to you now if there's anything you want to elaborate on for the audience and for George before we kick off. Thanks, Polly.
Sure. Thanks very much, Eb, and thank you to everyone for joining us this evening, especially George for making time for us down in the colonies. It's very much appreciated. So I'm just going to step back a bit and give some context for your context. And what I'm talking about with Australia can be applied globally. So even though I'm talking about Australia, this is universal. As you said, Australia's environment is officially poor and deteriorating. Our greenhouse gas emissions are increasing, land clearing is increasing, Australian governments are still subsidising and approving fossil fuels and native forest logging. We're the world's 13th largest economy, and we're a country that is happy to spend $300 billion on nuclear submarines that no one ever asked for. But the rhetoric from our leaders, despite being such a wealthy country and still doing harm, is that, well, basically it's boohoo. It's very sad that our ecosystems and life support systems are collapsing, but really sorry, the government can't afford to protect the environment, guys. So we're going to need the private sector to step in. And that's fine. But what has been proposed is not making industry pay for the damage it does, or regulating or stopping the damage it does, which are both pretty effective ideas. It's this idea that by creating incredibly complex and made-up environmental markets and financial instruments, the private sector will want to voluntarily invest in the protection of the environment because there's some profit to be made. So fundamentally, it's the same principle of neoliberalism that we see elsewhere in Australian and global policy: marketisation, privatisation, profit maximisation to the environment. And we've already had environmental markets that have failed. Privatisation more broadly has had disastrous consequences. Yet despite the repeated social, environmental and economic failures of neoliberalism to efficiently deliver public services or care for our community, governments globally are doubling down on this concept. So having said all that, the first question I would like to ask you, George, is, does the Australian context surprise you at all? And what do you think the chances are that Green Wall Street will crash?
Thank you. Excellent question. And thank you, both Polly and Ebony, for that really brilliant introduction, which actually introduces some of the key themes of what I was hoping we would discuss. One of those first key themes is the creation of markets. You know, this whole story we're told is that there's this natural law called the free market. This is the way things are. This is the way they've always been. It just organically springs into being. But as we see very clearly with this case, it doesn't organically spring into being. It's created deliberately, and a new set of property rights is established. And then you say, right, this set of property rights is going to be called a market, and it's a free market, and people can do what they want in it. But of course, you can't. You know, if you are the Aboriginal owners of the land and you say, we assert rights to all the nature here and to the natural resources, someone comes along and say, well, no, actually, that's my property because the Australian government has established that it's my property. So, you know, it's very far from being free, even though they have created what appears to be a market. And, you know, finance is the answer. What was the question? Seems to be the determining feature of our times. Now, of course, the moment you create a market, you create a lobby. And that lobby then tries to ensure that the market pours money into its own pockets rather than anybody else's pockets. And the lobby is the determining feature of what we call democratic politics. It's corporate power, oligarchic power, tends to exercise far more control over governments than the electorate does. And this is massively enhanced by something that Peter, my co-author, and I call the pollution paradox. And it's a really important thing, I think, to get your head around, because it explains so much of what goes wrong in our politics and indeed in our relationship with the living world. And the pollution paradox operates as follows: that the dirtiest, the most damaging, the most antisocial, the most dangerous corporations and commercial interests have the greatest interest in investing in politics, because if they don't pour money into politics, they will get regulated out of existence because people hate them. And in any democratic system, we would say, we don't want these people trashing our lives and trashing the living planet. So they're the ones who absolutely shove money into the pockets of politicians, either corruptly or above the table through political funding, campaign finance. And as a result of that, politics comes to be dominated by the dirtiest, the most damaging, the most antisocial and dangerous corporations and commercial interests. So we end up with the worst possible people in charge. And now, as we see, to come back to the theme of your question, the development of these so-called markets in nature and the valuation of nature, putting a price on what are now called natural assets or natural capital, to make this even worse, which is in fact a total contradiction in terms. There can be no such thing as natural capital. By definition, it is fundamentally wrong. We're going to see all the worst aspects of capitalism applied to the supposed task of saving the living world from environmental collapse caused by, oh yes, capitalism. And as you both suggested in your introduction, it's going to be all carrot and no stick. You know, there are ways in which we can absolutely protect the living world, but they involve regulation. They involve containing corporate power, containing oligarchic power, stymieing the attempts of capital to turn natural wealth into pounds, shillings and pence, or dollars and cents. But what we're seeing instead of that regulation is the exact opposite. We're handing over the whole caboodle to capital and turning the living world into dollars and cents as a supposed solution to that very problem. You extend the scale of the problem in the name of solving it. And why do you do that? Because you have a finance lobby which says we need to expand the capitalist frontier. Capital dies unless its frontier keeps expanding. Where can we expand it into? Oh, yes, we can expand it into nature.
On that, and you talked about this, the natural law of the free market before. One of the things that I found very chilling in the book, in a good way, is a sentence very early on where you say, we are all neoliberals now. It's like, we are the Borg. And even those of us who are critical of market fundamentalism, I don't think even realise how deeply entrenched we are in this system. And what always baffles me is the academics, the very smart and dedicated academics and conservationists and activists who rail in the way that you said, we know these polluters are bad, but these people have also adopted the idea that markets can protect the environment. So do you think that's a symptom of what you talk about? This is like a law that we just don't even realise?
So I think most people, most of the time, side with the status quo, whatever that status quo might be. It might be social democracy, we all become social democrats. It might be Nazism, we all become Nazis. It might be Stalinism, we all become Stalinists. Now it is neoliberalism. That is the dominant ideology. And to a greater or lesser extent, almost everyone is a neoliberal. In fact, not to be a neoliberal is a conscious, determined decision which requires effort every single day of your life, not to be swept along with that dominant social current. And that's going to be the same with every dominant social current. To be a dissident is a conscious decision. Not to make a conscious decision is to be the dominant thing. And the dominant thing is now neoliberalism. Now, just to sort of step back a moment so people know exactly what we're talking about. Neoliberalism is the means by which capitalism solves its biggest problem, which is called democracy. Now, people are very vague about what capitalism is, and huge numbers of people confuse it with commerce. Oh, it's just buying and selling stuff. That's commerce. That's not capitalism. Capitalism is a very particular form of economic organization, which Peter and I, drawing on the brilliant work of the geographer Jason Moore, date back quite precisely to about 1450 on the island of Madeira in the Atlantic. And this was the first place where the three conditions that the anthropologist Karl Polanyi set for capitalism to occurred simultaneously as far as we can discover. And those are the commodification of land, of labor, and of money, all in the same place. And it was on the island of Madeira in about 1450 that first happened, where the sugar planters had what was a very rare case of genuine terra nullius, in that this was land which was uninhabited. Madeira, when the Portuguese stumbled across it in 1420, had no people on it. They named it after the thing they wanted most there, which was Madeira, timber, which they're very short of in Portugal. And they said, whoa, free land, fantastic. And that land had no cultural baggage, no connotations, no one to say, this is mine. So it was a blank slate, so it could be commoditized. They then said, right, if we're going to plant sugar here, because it turned out to be a very good climate for sugar, we need labor. Where are we going to find labor? There's no one here. Oh, we'll bring in slaves. And so they started bringing in slaves, first from the Canary Islands, then from Africa. That slavery is fully commoditized labor. You cut people off from their society, from their culture, from their wishes, everything. You totally commoditize that labor supply. And then they said, oh, wait a minute, we're going to need money. Where do we get money? Where's the easiest, cheapest place to get money from? Oh, Flanders and Genoa. Previously, if you wanted money, you'd have to go to your local landlord, and it was completely tied up with with local power, with religious and cultural baggage, but you detach it from all that, you've commoditized your money supply. And in doing so, they accidentally invented this new form, this new model of economic organization. And it turned out to be incredibly successful. Very quickly, you could make a huge amount of money because you weren't tied down by that baggage, that social, cultural, historical baggage. You could just do exactly what you wanted. And the result of that was almost instant environmental collapse. They had a massive sugar boom. For 30 years, Madeira became the world's premier site for sugar, even though it was a major source, even though it's a tiny island in the Atlantic, did incredibly well. And then bang, it went down spectacularly, total collapse. Why? Because Madeira ran out of Madeira. You need 60 kilograms of wood to refine a kilogram of sugar. And very quickly, they exploited the nearest, most accessible forests, completely destroyed those. The slaves had to go further and further afield to find wood, to find Madeira, to stoke the boilers. Their productivity of labor collapsed as a result. And then they did what capitalists have gone on to do ever since. They left. And they went to San Tomé, another island in the Atlantic, did exactly the same there. Then they left again and they went to the coast of Brazil. They worked their way up the coast of Brazil doing the same thing. Left that, went to the Caribbean. Boom, bust, quit is what capitalism does. That is a peculiar feature of capitalism, which distinguishes it from other forms of commerce. It starts with colonial appropriation and environmental destruction, and it carries on that way, constantly expanding its frontier, whether it's a geographic frontier, whether it's a social frontier, whether it's a financial frontier. It's always finding new frontiers of exploitation, exploiting them until collapse, and then moving on. That's the peculiarity of capitalism. Now, that did very well, just fine, until about 150 years ago when some idiot gave adults a vote. Oh my God, people can vote. That's the last thing we want. Because when people vote, they say, hang on a minute, we don't want to be commoditized anymore. We want some labor rights. We want outrageous things like decent wages and some time off, even the weekend. That would be nice. And we don't actually want our entire landscape to be trashed and our air to be polluted. We want to see the living world protected. And we don't want to live in terrible conditions, horrible places. We want some decent homes. So, people start demanding rights. And that was the biggest threat that capital has ever faced since the invention of capitalism in about 1450. And so ever since, it's been trying to solve that problem, the problem of democracy, or the problem of voting at any rate. And one very effective way of solving that is fascism. This is why every fascist movement which has ever arisen has been backed by big capital. But fascism ran into a problem in 1945 in that it lost. And it was quite difficult to bring it back after that. So what do? You need some other means of solving capitalism's problem, and neoliberalism was the way of doing it. And neoliberalism says, everything except the total freedom of capitalists is an outrage which must be rolled back. So regulation must be rolled back, trade unions must be rolled back, taxes must be rolled back, even democracy itself must be rolled back. And they created this whole infrastructure of justification, this apparatus to try to persuade us that this outrageous set of proposals, taking away our fundamental rights, was just common sense, and anyone who opposed it was an idiot and an enemy of progress. And in order to do that, some of the richest people on earth created this network of so-called think tanks, these opaquely funded lobby groups, of academic institutes, of tame journalists, of tame politicians, to start introducing a system which made the outrageous look like common sense. And that system of thought, that ideology, is neoliberalism.
Oh, that's okay. Off the back of that, no, I'm just trying to form this question, because neoliberalism makes us feel like we are free. That's what it does. It says, we shouldn't have all these horrible regulations. You've got choice as consumers. You're free. So, our expectations of government have dropped so dramatically, and we think that's a good thing that governments are not ruling our lives. I'm generalising. Of course, democracy thrives on high expectations. At the same time, our guilt over not doing enough is higher than ever, and it doesn't matter how many keep cups we buy as, exercising our rights as consumers, problems aren't being fixed. Is this kind of a fundamental design feature of neoliberalism, making us feel free, but ultimately making us impotent, I suppose, to do anything?
Thank you. I think you put your finger on something really important here, which is the use of the word freedom. It's very interesting, actually, seeing Kamala Harris's campaign trying to reclaim the term freedom from the Republicans, which is clearly a deliberate ploy. Now, I'm not saying that they're by any means Kamala Harris and the Democrats are a riposte to neoliberalism. They're not really, but at least they are trying to engage with this idea that the term freedom has been stolen from us. It's been completely corrupted by the uses to which neoliberals and Republicans and others, Liberal Party and others, have put it. As the great philosopher of the last century, E.H. Tawney, pointed out, freedom for the pike is death to the minnow, which I guess in Australian terms would translate into freedom for the kingfish is death to the baitfish. The same freedom can be liberating for some people at the expense of other people. So, for instance, if you say, we're going to free you from the regulations governing pollution, and society is now free from these regulations, what that means is that the polluters are free to impose pollution on the rest of us. Or we're going to free corporations from the curse of trade unions. And you say, oh, that's wonderful. We're all going to be free from trade unions. But of course, what that means is that the bosses are free to exploit the workers. So the bosses get freedom, the workers suffer for that. And we have constantly to interrogate this word freedom, which is used against us as a weapon. We all want freedom. We want to be liberated from oppressive forces. But it's the oppressive forces that have been liberated through neoliberalism. They've been liberated to exploit us. That's the whole damn point of the doctrine. But because their use of the term freedom is so seldom challenged, and there's this assumption that freedom for the boss is freedom for the worker, that freedom for the polluter is freedom for the polluted, this lazy assumption pushed out, or it's not even lazy, it's deliberate in many cases, pushed out by the Murdoch media and the rest of the billionaire press, that we have almost become used to this idea that we should accept the billionaires' freedom rather than our own freedoms. And it's our democratic freedoms which they are seeking to take from us in order that they should be free. We cannot be free unless we capture and contain the oligarchs and the corporations, unless they are in chains. And we must chain them through democratically mediated regulation. We must chain them through effective taxation. We must chain them through a whole series of controls that people like John Maynard Keynes understood were absolutely fundamental to running a fair economy that have been forgotten since then.
Yeah. I was going to ask you something, but actually I'm going to pivot for a moment. I've got a line of questioning along this, but I want to make sure that I get you talking about this. This has been a life KPI, George. So I'm just going to dive in. I'm sorry to change the topic, but I don't know if you're aware, Australia is one of the world's largest fossil fuel exporters. We're also the world's fourth largest carbon offset developer. Australia issues around 20 million carbon offsets a year. By just after 2030, we will be the world's largest carbon offset developer, 45 billion offsets a year. Land-based carbon offsetting is Australia's only climate policy. None of them are real, but they're easy to move around in an Excel spreadsheet. You've been talking about the multifaceted problems with carbon offsets for years, and it's not entirely unrelated to what you were just saying. Why are offsets not dead yet?
offsets aren't dead because capital does very nicely out of offsets. It creates a problem and then it sells you the solution. And it, you create a new market. I mean, it's not that capital created, government created the market. As always, this thing called the market, this supposedly free market, is absolutely a political construct. And it's also a scientific construct. It's a construct in that it doesn't have a scientific basis, but it's discussed as if it does. So what we can say about offsets is that producing carbon pollution through burning fossil fuels or through livestock, those are the two primary sources, or through several other of the activities that we do, is a dead cert. When you burn a ton of oil, you produce a certain amount of carbon dioxide. When you burn a ton of coal, you produce a certain amount of carbon dioxide. When you graze a herd of cattle, you produce a certain amount of methane and nitrous oxide. Those are absolute certainties. That is solid science. A leads to B. It's very, very simple. Carbon offsets are completely, at best, completely uncertain. We might be able to retire this amount of carbon and it might stay in the ground or stay in the tree or stay in the cooking stove offset or whatever it is that you've done for a certain amount of time. And it might equate in 20 years to the equivalent of what we are doing today. Well, there's two fundamental and obvious problems with that. Number one, what we do today is far more important than what happens tomorrow. We're in an emergency, and if you don't deal with the emergency right now, then it becomes too late very quickly. And even if you get everything right in 20, 30, 40 years, we could already have passed key planetary tipping points. So offsetting into the future is not exchanging like for like. It's exchanging a certainty of destruction against a possibility of salvation which may not come to pass in time. Number two, so many of these offsets fall apart. Even as they're issued, at the moment you look at them hard, you say, that's not going to fly. So, for instance, what seemed to be the most obvious and easy offset of all, which was forest conservation or reforestation, and you think that is surely the set of offsets which is easiest to document, easiest to show additionality, easiest to show continuity. It turns out that a huge tranche of those offsets are basically fraudulent, that they simply don't do what they claim to do, that if there is carbon sequestration, in many cases it's already been reversed, that in many cases they're selling what was already happening as if it were new and additional to what would have happened in that utterly theoretical, conjectural future of this might stay the same, this might not stay the same. I mean, what you're selling is always very hard to pin down. And in many cases, it's just not there at all. The offset gets sold, people make themselves rich in doing so, but nothing actually happens to retire any greenhouse gases. And that's the best case. The forest side of it is the easiest thing to document. Yeah, we're now moving on to soil carbon in a big way. And boy, everyone's going mad for soil carbon credits. This is South Sea bubble territory. This is absolute madness. Yeah, you can sequester carbon for the long term in saturated soils, waterlogged soils, in other words. Peat, fundamentally, is what we're talking about. Soil in marshes, freshwater marshes, saltwater marshes, is not an absolute certainty because global heating can turn those carbon sinks into carbon sources and they can start outgassing methane and carbon dioxide. But at least in principle, peat and other water-saturated soils can accumulate carbon. You just cannot do it reliably in an aerated soil. And what they're trying to sell us again and again is carbon sequestration in agricultural soil. Agricultural soils are aerated. They cannot keep accumulating carbon. It does not work like that because that carbon gets oxidized. Bacteria break it down. Even the most complex and supposedly stable humic acid molecules can be broken down by bacteria. You can accumulate carbon one year, it gets broken down the next year, and it's gone. Moreover, we can't even accurately measure soil volume or soil bulk density at the moment. So we haven't even got a baseline for how much carbon is in the soil in the first place, let alone having the accurate tools to measure any increments of carbon year on year. And yet this is a big new frontier in selling carbon offsets. There's hundreds of millions of dollars flying around the world now buying offsets in aerated soils. It's total fraud from the very outset. But the carbon emissions from these polluting industries which are buying the offsets, those are real.
This must be what people feel like when they go to church and they feel salvation. Thank you. Would you be okay with us? Well, would you give us the rights to making a George Monbiot doll that with pull a cord on its back, it says, is this the quote? Offsets are the certainty of destruction versus the possibility of salvation. This is absolute madness. We can.
Sadly, I think the major market for that doll would be people wanting to buy it to stick pins in it.
Still buying it, still a market. Conceiving of really big, bold changes and asking for big, bold changes can be hard if you think that you're a lone voice. You know, you were saying earlier that that you don't win many friends, I suppose, having big ideas, and the media is not very keen on covering things that are not, I suppose, the status quo. Again, that's a feature, not a design flaw of neoliberalism. There's this sense of despair and buying keep cups and carbon neutral petrol, which we sell in Australia, it's certified by the government. That's only feeding that sense of despair because nothing's changing. Could you talk about modern instances where people have made change and how that happened to show that it is actually possible? We're coming up to a federal election and there's very much the sense that we pick the party that is less bad than the other major party.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like strongly to endorse what you say about the media. I mean, the media is, with a very few exceptions, our enemy. It really is. It's up there with fossil fuel companies, up there with the mining conglomerates as being like a gun pointed at the head of humanity, because what it does is to provide the social license which those damaging corporations need to operate, constantly pouring out justifications for planetary destruction, justifications for injustice, justifications for inhumanity. It's just constantly telling us that up is down and 2 + 2 = whatever they want it to be. This has been the frontier for neoliberalism and the frontier for all other forms of deception of the public on a massive scale. And it's not just the Murdoch empire, horrendous as that is, the evil empire run by the Murdoch family. Here in the UK, the BBC is absolutely up to its neck in this. It just mouths neoliberal platitudes day in, day out, and there's no room for people like me on the BBC at all anymore. Because we're dangerous. We work against the grain of capital, and therefore we have to be shut up. And this whole talk of freedom has been accompanied by the extreme censorship of all those with dissenting views. And so we find ourselves in a difficult situation, but that's not the same as saying it's an impossible situation. And many people in other societies face and have faced far worse. We see dissidents even in totalitarian regimes whose lives are constantly threatened by their dissent, which is not in any way the case for someone like me. I can live a perfectly safe and comfortable life. I can just get bloody frustrated with the environment in which I try to work as a journalist, but that's not in any way to say that my life is at risk. But what was it? Last year, 200 environmental defenders in different parts of the world were murdered. And the courage, the solidarity, the coming together of people in the face of these threats is a constant inspiration. This is the thing which motivates me, which keeps me going, which gives me hope, is seeing what people are prepared to do to defend themselves, defend their communities, defend the living planet. And despite these 200 people being murdered last year, still their communities are fighting those battles. Still people around the world who could be killed at any moment for trying to defend their land, their natural wealth. Still they are standing up to these immensely powerful forces of capital. And sometimes the weak people turn out to be more powerful than the powerful people, because that example, that inspiration which they deliver through that courage, through showing that they are prepared to sacrifice their lives, that can and does change the world. But of course, we need a system. What we need to do is to produce systemic change. And one of the great failings of mainstream environmental campaigning, and indeed mainstream political campaigning, progressive political campaigning, throughout the neoliberal era, has been a lack of ambition. It's been cowardice, effectively. I'm not in any way talking about those frontline environmental defenders. Those are the brave people. But the big environmental NGOs, we don't want to scare people. We don't want to get in trouble with the charity commissioners. We don't want to lose any membership. We don't want to alienate anyone. So we won't ask for very much. And maybe if we have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, one day all those little incremental changes will add up to systemic change. Bollocks. That's not how it happens. The plural of incremental change is not systemic change. The plural of incremental change is failure. Right? And always, when we're trying to get these little changes, or let's move to cotton buds which have paper stems, not plastic ones. Let's recycle our bottle tops. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to do. That's not going to take you anywhere. While we're doing all that stuff, the other side, first the neoliberals, now the radical right, they have pursued systemic change and they have achieved it. They've changed everything. They've turned us all into neoliberals. They've changed the human psyche. Everything has changed while we're saying, we're not sure people are ready for change. It's extraordinary nonsense. So what we've got to do, first of all, is decide what we actually want. And if you ask a lot of the big environmental NGOs, or indeed political parties, political campaigns, what do you actually want? They say, well, a little bit less of that. That's not a political program. A few modifications of neoliberalism. Sorry, no, that is never going to take you anywhere. All that does is to play into the hands of your opponents. What we need is different systems, different economic systems, different political systems. And that's what Peter and I have tried to do in the book, drawing on brilliant work of other people. Never, ever are you alone in this. You're always standing on the shoulders of giants. You're always making use of other people's work, of synthesizing it, of trying to pluck good ideas from here and good ideas from there and bringing them together into what could look like a system of change. And that's what we're trying to do. We've seen some fantastic examples of how political and economic systems can change. And so, one of the ones which inspires me most is what happened in the Brazilian city of Porto Alegre between 1989 and roughly 2004, a period of about 15 years. And during that period, that city was run by its people. It had been one of the most corrupt cities in Brazil, effectively run by a mafia. The council was totally in the hands of sort of powerful local oligarchs. You'd issue contracts to build an unnecessary bridge to your brother-in-law or to your mate in the local cartel, and all the money was wasted. As a result, Porto Alegre was at the bottom of the Human Development Index for large cities in Brazil. A new municipal government came in, the Partido dos Trabalhadores, the PT, and they said, we're going to do things completely differently. We're going to put the budget in the hands of the people. You, the citizens, are going to decide how the money is spent. And everyone said, well, that's ridiculous. What do they know? Half the citizens of this city are illiterate. How can they possibly create a budget? And they're going to make the stupidest decisions. Oh my God, they're going to build all these unnecessary bridges. And they're going to give contracts. Oh no, wait a minute, that's what the last lot did. Anyway, so they did this and they said, right, not only are you going to decide the budget, you're going to decide the process by which this budgeting happens. This was radical stuff. You're going to hand all this over to the people. That's kind of democracy. That's terribly dangerous. You can't do that. People are idiots. And the most extraordinary thing happened, because the amazing thing about participatory democracy is that it works better in practice than it does in theory. You can always come up with 100 reasons why it's not going to work, but when it does work, what it does is it transforms the people who engage with it. It turns them into democratic citizens, and they engage seriously and deeply, and they take on this burden of responsibility with enthusiasm. You'd think no one would want to turn up. How boring is that? Setting the municipal budget. 50,000 people a year turned up at these meetings to set the budget. And the highest representation was in the poorest areas, because they could see that this was going to make the biggest difference to their lives. And within a remarkably short period of time, they completely turned that city around. Massive improvements in maternal mortality rates, infant mortality rates, primary healthcare, primary education, sanitation, sewerage, public transport, right across the board. Porto Alegre came out as #1 on the Human Development Index for large cities in Brazil. It was a complete transformation, and the people turned into democratic citizens. Now, eventually it got stifled when the forces of capital swept back in. Since 2004, it's gradually been sat on until it's more or less gone away. But there is a model there, a model we can build on, a model that should inspire us all over the world. Why can't we set our own municipal budget? Why can't we set our own national budgets? Why can't we build on systems, for instance, put forward by Murray Bookchin, with this system where you build your politics from the ground up? Your primary political unit is the local borough, the local village, the neighborhood, effectively, and then you delegate decisions upwards rather than downwards. This is what people in the northeast of Syria, in this autonomous region of Rojava, have attempted to do under extremely difficult circumstances, and to a remarkable extent have succeeded, creating by far and away the most democratic enclave in the whole region. There's brilliant examples in Taiwan, in Barcelona, in Madrid, in Paris, doubtless. Oh, Melbourne. Yes, Melbourne, of course, is one of the places. I mean, it could go much, much further, but one of the places where participatory democracy has been given a little bit of scope. But it should be, I think, the primary form of social organization. I'm not suggesting sweeping away representative democracy completely. I think it still has some functions, but at the moment, we delegate all our powers to remote authority. Once every 4 or 5 years, we put a cross on a piece of paper, and then we are deemed to consent to everything the winning party does for the next 4 or 5 years. We don't accept the principle of presumed consent in sex. Why should we accept it in politics? But that's what the whole political system is based on, presumed consent. Because more people gave a cross to this party than to other parties, we then have a mandate to do whatever the heck we want that we can get through Parliament for the next 5 years. That's not democracy. That's a mockery, a caricature of democracy. We could do it so much better.
It's a particular mockery in Australia because we don't have any truth in political advertising laws. So you can lie in a political ad and someone ticks that box. I'm conscious that we have a lot of questions in the chat. So at this point, I might hand back over to you, Eb. I have lots more I want to ask, but I won't be a George piggy.
Thanks everyone. I can see we've got about 840 people on the line with us today, and a lot of questions here for George. George, I've got one that I want to ask about the water supply later in the UK and the privatisation of that, but there's a strong theme amongst all of the questioners here, which is what comes after neoliberalism, which I think you were kind of just talking about there. But what does that model look like, and how do we get our politicians there, essentially? Two of the key themes on a lot of questions.
Thanks very much, Evie. So I've talked a little bit about the political side. There's a lot more to discuss there, and we go into it in a little more depth in the book. But let's talk briefly about some of the economic aspects of it, because we need an alternative to capitalism, right? There is people talk, oh, there's good capitalism and there's bad capitalism. No, we don't like the corporate capitalism or the crony capitalism or corrupt capitalism. No, sorry, the problem is not the adjective. The problem is the noun. There is no good capitalism. There will never be good capitalism. And you understand that the moment you understand what capitalism is. People say, oh, it's easier to picture the end of the world than the end of capitalism. That's because we can't picture what capitalism is, so you can't picture its end until you know what you're talking about. So it's absolutely fundamental that we take control of this narrative and say, this is what we're talking about. This is capitalism. It's not the same as just commerce. It's a different thing. It's an entire economic model, a very particular, very specific economic model, which has trashed the whole planet and our lives. So we need an alternative to that. And the framing that Peter and I use in our book is private sufficiency, public luxury. So the argument here is that there is enough for everyone on earth to lead a decent life, right? As Gandhi said, there's enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. And that we should all be entitled to have our basic needs met, and met as we would wish to have them met. I mean, it should be up to us to determine how those needs are best met. And if we want to meet them privately, if we want to have our own small domain, our home with our own things in it, then absolutely, that is a fundamental right that people should have to meet our fundamental needs. But if you want to spread your wings and you want luxury, well, there's simply not enough ecological or even physical space for everyone to have private luxury. If everyone had their private jet and their private yacht and their super homes and their fleet of cars and their own art gallery and their own swimming pool and their own play barn and their own tennis court and all these other things, well, in a country like England, for instance, if everyone in London had that, that would be the whole of England swallowed up. I mean, there's not even the physical space, let alone the ecological space. You would cook the planet in about 5 minutes. We simply can't live like that. And yet the promise of capitalism is that we all will. The reason we subscribe to capitalism is that we all think we're temporarily embarrassed millionaires. We all think that the finger will point at us next. We're going to be the winners in this system because that's what we've been promised, and that's what neoliberalism is constantly promising us. We can all be number one, a mathematically impossible promise. But we believe this promise. But of course, the system relies on exploitation. Some people are so rich and have so much because they are exploiting other people, extracting their labor, extracting the value that they create, extracting their resources, trashing their lives. Only one person can be number one, and only a few people, only 1,000 people can be in the top 1,000. It's just simple maths which somehow we fail to grasp. But we can all aspire to public luxury. We can all have magnificent public swimming pools and public tennis courts and public parks and public resources of all kinds, great transport systems, all the other things which can make life really brilliant, but we can share those. Instead of excluding people by saying, I'm going to create an enormous garden which is going to take up a big section of this town because I'm super rich and I can afford to do that, taking land away from people, you say, I'm going to create a magnificent public park. Well, we are going to create a magnificent public park, which is going to be owned and controlled by the community. And that is going to open up space for people rather than closing it down. Private sufficiency, public luxury.
Love it. That sounds, I'd like to sign up for that. And I was, lucky enough to travel to Copenhagen recently and Oslo, and the ease of the public transport systems there, how easy they make it to cycle around and how much they've invested in that infrastructure is not only makes it nicer to be a cyclist, but also to be a pedestrian. And the nicer it is, the more people use it. It's so straightforward. Yeah, I love that. Public luxury. Sign me up. I want to ask a much more specific question and asserting my prerogative as host, one I'm personally invested in. I read a lot of your columns at the beginning of the year about the UK's water supply being privatised and all the problems that happen with discharging of raw sewage into your rivers and catchments, and your catchments being polluted. Can you give us an update on where all that is up to? Because it seemed, completely outrageous.
Yeah. So in this country, like in every country, we can't name things. We seem to have this sort of speech impediment when it comes to actually naming what our sources of oppression are. And so we say, oh yeah, this was Thatcherism. And sorry, Thatcherism is just the word in Britain that we give to neoliberalism. In the US, they call it Reaganism, but it turned into Blairism or New Labourism. But no, that's just neoliberalism. It's all neoliberalism. We should start calling these things what they are. It's what the neoliberals originally called it before they buried the name, because they didn't want anyone to recognize it as an ideology anymore. They just wanted to say that this is just the way things are. This is like a natural law. It's like evolution or like gravity. Yeah, we have to name it. And neoliberalism, promoted by Margaret Thatcher, who was our first fully neoliberal prime minister, said, private good, public bad. The private sector, the market, will always manage resources much better than the public sector can. It's much more efficient. Oh yeah, it is much more efficient at pouring money into the pockets of shareholders and executives. And Mrs. Thatcher, in line precisely with neoliberal doctrine. I mean, she didn't invent these ideas. They'd been worked on for 30 years before she took power, and refined and developed by these sinister lobby groups, these so-called think tanks, free market think tanks, now neoliberal junk tanks, these lobby groups whose whole idea is to turn these really dark and dangerous ideas into apparent political common sense. They fed her the lines. In fact, they were very clear about taking responsibility. We did this. Hey, aren't we fantastic? Yay, we introduced water privatization. And the very first televised Prime Minister's question time in the UK was Thatcher defending water privatization. You can see it on YouTube. And she said, oh, you're saying all these things. Yes, but you will see. Time will tell what a brilliant idea this is, how it will make everything better. And what it has created is it has turned our rivers into open sewers. We've gone back to the Victorian era in terms of the absolute filth. Across every river in Britain now is in bad ecological condition. There's not a single river in good ecological condition. Well, in England and Wales, there's one or two in Scotland, but they've just been completely trashed, not just by the water companies, but to a very large extent by them, just pumping raw sewage straight down the rivers because that's the most cost-effective way. And don't imagine you people have got no part in this, because Macquarie Bank was one of the biggest investors in our privatized water system and completely trashed it. So they invested heavily in one of these companies, Thames Water, and then they invested heavily. They bought into it. They then loaded that company with debt. They sucked the debt out in the form of dividends, and then they walked away. And Thames Water is now left with a £15 billion debt, no functioning assets just about, and it's like the worst performing of all the water companies, and it's just completely trashing all the rivers, sucking the aquifers dry. It's totally failed to invest in new infrastructure, update the sewers, build reservoirs, any of that, because all the money went into the pockets of the shareholders instead. And it's left us with this huge legacy, both of debt and of shit. So thank you, Macquarie Bank. Great public service you delivered to us there.
I'll add that to the list of terribly damaging exports from Australia alongside fossil fuels and the Murdoch empire.
It's our fault. We invited them in. The Chinese state, the state of Qatar, they own our water. The British state isn't allowed to own our water companies, but all these sovereign wealth funds from other countries, they're allowed to own our water companies. It's just utter madness.
Yeah, I mean, Australia's had the exact same phenomenon with a lot of privatized industries here ending up in just absolute neglect and disarray. Our aged care sector, the banks, lots of things, exactly the same. Robert Day asked a question. We recently hosted the Nobel laureate economist, Professor Joseph Stiglitz in Australia, and he talked a lot about that same quote, freedom for the wolves is death for the sheep, that kind of an idea. And also his research has shown that neoliberal economics it's not efficient. It kind of causes inequality and it reduces democratic freedom. So Robert Day's question was, how do we get our politicians out of that framework? Is it getting back to putting things into public ownership? Is it that regulation path? How do we move away from this path that we're on at the moment?
Now, I've got great respect for Joe Stiglitz. I love his work, but I think his framing is fundamentally wrong. He basically says there is productive capitalism and there's unproductive capitalism. He fails to define capitalism, and he goes along with this consensus view, oh, it's just commerce, it's just buying and selling. And he says, there's capitalism that creates value and capitalism that destroys value. And, he talks about the sort of parasitical aspects of capitalism. All correct, but it all destroys value in the long run, because it is exploiting our natural wealth, turning it into money, taking it away from future generations. It is all ultimately destructive. And he is, bless him, because I love the guy. I think he's fantastic, but he is locked in that mindset. And he's done brilliant work. And don't take it away from him. But you've got to break out of that prison. It's a prison of thinking which goes beyond neoliberalism. It's because it goes right the way back to the origins of capitalism. And while you're still in that capitalist mindset and still trying to find justifications for, well, maybe there could be a better form of capitalism, or, capitalism is the answer, we just need to do it right, rather than challenging those fundamentals. Until you can make those challenges, you're always going to be part of the problem and not part of the solution. And now I've gone and completely forgotten your question.
It was more the politicians' response and getting our politicians off this track. So I guess my question is more around, and Robert's question, how do we get politicians out of that framework and into re-regulating these industries and clawing back some of that corporate power that you've been discussing?
Yeah. So I mean, for that to happen, we do need a far more active and informed population. That there are three key elements to political change, each of which has to be applied. They are mobilization, mobilization, and mobilization. We have to work together. We have to come together in effective campaigns. And one of the devastating impacts of neoliberalism is it told us you are alone and you ought to be alone. You are a consumer, not a citizen. That's one of the most effective reframings that has ever taken place in human history. And as a consumer, if you want political change, buy a better brand of biscuits. That never changed anything. It will never change anything. The only way that change has ever happened is by active political citizens coming together, creating campaigns and building them. And that's the only thing which can ever push politicians along in a positive direction. Because all the time, you've got the plutocrats whispering in their ears, the lobby groups saying, do this for us, do this for us. And unless they're getting big pushback from the other side, they're just going to go with that. They're just, even if they start with good intentions, and let's face it, a lot of them do not start with good intentions, but even if they do, they get pushed along on that stream of shit produced by the pollution paradox. So we have to push back, but we can't do that alone. We are totally powerless and ineffective alone, but there is no limit to our power when we come together. So it's creating these highly effective, creative, innovative campaigns. The campaigning model of tomorrow will have to be completely different to the campaigning model of today. I can't tell you what it is. Some genius will emerge and tell you what it is. We were in our darkest days when a 15-year-old Swedish schoolgirl started sitting outside Parliament there. Who would have guessed that's where the new momentum would have come from? But it always comes. There is always someone. There is always something which emerges, and you say, yes, that's it. That's going to give us the new boost. And when those moments come, in the meantime, our role is to be ready and to be able to jump straight on and to go with that and to build that campaign. And it's only through mass mobilization that anything can ever change.
Well, I think we have to wrap it up there. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And thank you, George, coming here or living here in Australia, where we've had successive governments that just want to keep expanding the fossil fuel industry and have really failed to take climate change seriously for a long time. You have been a lone voice of sanity for many of us here, reading your columns and books over many years, and we really appreciate your time this evening. Thanks to you, Polly, as well for this evening. And just a reminder that George Monbiot's book, co-authored with Peter Hutchison, is called The Invisible Doctrine, The Secret History of Neoliberalism and How It Came to Control Your Life. We thank you so much for your time this evening, George, and thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. A reminder that the recording from this will go up on our YouTube channel. And for anyone who lives in or near Sydney, don't forget that you can get tickets to see President Jose Ramos Horta at the Sydney Opera House from the Sydney Opera House website, just $19.50. That is on Tuesday, the 8th of October, and we hope to see you there. Thank you for a wonderful discussion this evening, George, for all of your time, all of your writings, and for that note of hope and optimism in a sea of shit. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Ebony. Thanks, Polly. And thank you, everyone. It was really great to talk to you all.
Thanks again. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye then.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.